points of time in history, but at the same time, chronologically at the same time in different places, Europe means very different things to different Europeans. Europe meant safeguarding democracy for my parents. Europe has meant a security guarantee for friends in Poland, probably here in Romania as well. And Europe has meant a slowdown of economic activity, unemployment for, I don't know, workers in northern Italy and in northern France. So it may be true, it may not be true, but it is true for certain categories of people and even for entire nations. Now, this is about narrative pluralism, and I think this is why Europe works, because it means different things for different peoples, and the treaties are very unclear about the end goal. It is just about an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. And this ever closer union can be a union of defense, can be just a market. So as long as we keep it open, this is how it works, and I don't think we need to change that. Now, at the same time, I think it's very obvious, and I'm not going to try to go against this notion, but I would be a bit critical of this. At the same time, it is very obvious that for all Europeans, European integration is about peace. Now, this is what the European Commission has been concerned in the last times. And again, here the easy thing would be to tell the Commission, hey, you were not really seeing into the future when in 2013 you declared that the narrative of peace is no longer relevant to Europeans than to our friends in Ukraine. This is still the rationale for having Europe. Now, of course, I'm not going to say the Commission needed to have anticipated that, although it also represents a very Western European perspective, because when the Commission started this reflection, Crimea was already under occupation. So probably we still need to rethink of to what extent do we have really a panel of European, sufficiently wide panel of European intellectuals when we discuss these things, but I'm not going to go into the easy criticism of the Commission there. But my point is that the Commission has started reconstructing what I call, not what I call, but Manes and Morley have called the Nobel Peace narrative retrospectively, in trying to tell us several things. One, that Europe always had a narrative of peace, and I think to have a narrative you need the public, and they need to be convinced by the European Commission who was the public that was consuming this narrative back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Probably the Commission is overinterpreting its ability to communicate back in the past. It is presenting that as a single narrative of Europe, as if peace had meant actually the same thing for all Europeans, and it is assuming that there is one Europe in the sense. And my point there is that, of course, I am not going to deny all the great contribution that the EU and European integration has done for peace in the continent, but we are ignoring some blind spots in this narrative. One is, of course, that the EU, the European communities, the Commission, the Parliament, and so on, was not the only European project at the time. There was the Council of Europe, there was the OECE, there was the Helsinki initiatives, all things that contribute to European integration that somehow we put together when we speak about Europe, but not necessarily when we speak about the EU. Then, historically, there's one very concerning thing on which, of course, the European Commission doesn't want to go in, but European states were not at peace when they signed the Rome Treaty. France was in the middle of a brutal war in Algeria. Belgium was, well, decolonizing Congo. European member states were colonial states still in 1958, not to speak about 1951 when we signed the Paris Treaty. So this is an aspect of European integration that we are ignoring when we say that Europe is only about peace. Europe was also about reconstructing member states from their colonial past and constructing a non-colonial perspective. And finally, of course, we have the Balkan Wars, the 1990s, when, well, of course, when we say war is back in Europe in the Ukraine aggression, we are ignoring the first occupation of Crimea already 10 years back, but we are also ignoring the Balkan War. So I think that when we declare that Europe was successful in achieving peace, I would say 90% is good narrative, but we need to pay attention to these blind spots. Now, the other easy thing to do would be to say it is very obvious that Europe needs to reinterpret its narrative of peace at times of war and say do we still have the right institutions? Do we still have the right policies? Do we have the right balance of ideas to make sense of this world? And if you look at how things are going, it is very easy to say yes, in the sense that what took a couple of years to do in the euro crisis at the beginning of the 2010s, took 4 months to do in the context of the COVID crisis, took 3 hours to do in the context of the Ukraine war, right? The euro responding united to aggression in the EU. It means that Europe has found itself in terms of the High Representative for Foreign Policy, Mr. Borrell, the ability to speak the language of power. Now, my concern there would be, and this is what I want to discuss, and then I have more uncertainties than anything, but I think that we need to critically appraise the narrative that is being built by European institutions, not only the Commission, by its member states, is to what extent these realist Europe, this Europe that speaks the language of power, that thinks geopolitically, as some new literature in European studies is suggesting, is still Europe. Because I think this is where, again, to go back to maybe a more Spanish narrative, but to the narratives of Spanish 98, when Spain lost the last remains of its colonial empire in 1998, we need to reflect about the soul of Europe, right? Which, by the way, was the title of this book by the Commission, the soul and body of Europe. So my point there would be, if you go to the last book by Foucault, his last course in the College of France, he has this sentence, I think, by Heraclitus, saying, war is the father of all things. Now, the easy thing for me to understand in this sentence is that war, of course, changes everything, right? And that when you are in a situation of war, everything that you assume becomes possible, what was unthinkable becomes thinkable, and that this Europe that we thought could never use its own funds to do something against the liberal order, against its traditional notion of peace is market, openness of words, and so on, has been directly using its money to fund the Ukrainian army, whether sufficiently or not is up for discussion, but the EU is funding the Ukrainian army. The EU has forbade the emission of Russian propaganda in Europe and so on. So very clearly the EU has demonstrated that it can react in a context of war. Now, my point here would be, and this is why I say, to what extent are we seeing a very rapid transformation of narratives? Because where I think we do really have a transformation is that maybe we are moving from narrative pluralism, this idea that every country, every social class, there were different narratives of Europe that coexisted, and that this contributed to some extent to make people appraise Europe in different ways and to approach the idea of integration. To what extent are we moving into something like narrative dialogy, in the sense that we have two contradictory narratives leading at the same time? So if you look at this narrative of Europe in conflict, you have the European Commission, member states, virtually telling us we are at non-declared war with Russia, right? There's no way to fly to Moscow from European member states. We are seeing aggression, we are expelling diplomats from the capitals, but at the same time, we keep speaking the language of contracts about gas, right? We don't pay your gas in rubles because according to the contract, we should do that in euro. I mean, how do you speak the language of contract, of civil or economic law with someone who, at the same time, if you're at war? So this is where I think that probably what we are seeing is this experience of dialogism, and there, this is where I think the narrative of European integration really becomes interesting, because if I go back to the work I quoted previously, Magnus and Mowbray, what they say is that actually all the time the narrative of peace in Europe has been spoken, in fact they write literally, with an economic motive, in the sense that building peace in the traditional European narrative has always been about creating a market, creating a rules-based economy, a rules-based approach to the world, and that this was the one thing that was going to civilize us, right? The fact that we have a market in common, that we would trade. Now, this is probably the one interpretation of the narrative that is changing very rapidly towards the exterior. We will no longer think that by trading with Russia, that by trading with China, even by trading with the United States, we are actually enhancing a liberal world order. Now, we need to assume that we need to trade because it's in our interest, but we are not changing the world by opening trade or by facilitating visa-free travel. Now, the other point is to what extent will that change towards the interior? Because probably not. I mean, I'm not going to develop that. We'll start a new project in October on fake news and disinformation in Europe. Probably the EU will keep speaking the language of market, the language of economy towards companies, towards actors inside. So we'll probably have this kind of dialogism for Europe that remains liberal towards its own 7 member states, towards its own companies, but becomes a bit more geopolitical to the world. And this is where I think that if we need to think of a new narrative for Europe in these times, this is where we need to be very critical and make this connection right, because otherwise we are becoming a bit of the late Roman Empire, right? We have order inside, and outside everyone is a barbarian. And, well, I'm not saying that the Russian aggression is not barbaric, but maybe we also have to assume that this is the world where we are going to live. And we need to maybe disentangle a bit of how we relate to these barbarians outside our gates. I mean, if we treat everyone like a threat, this is where I think we will stop being Europe. Probably what we need is to be a different kind of Europe, where we assume, in more critical terms, that we have been wrong. I mean, if I quote the unquotable Mr. Mersheimer now, maybe we have done a bit too much of liberal promotion outside. This has not worked. So this is, I think, the kind of discourse that we need to disentangle. But if we go all the other way, if we start thinking all the time that I'm not going to discuss Russia, but China, anyone in the Middle East, anyone in Northern Africa is a threat, a potential threat to us, I think this is going to transform who we are as Europeans. I think that this is where we need to develop a narrative that at the same time makes us aware that the world, that to some extent our previous vision of the world has failed, without transforming how we see ourselves as part of this world. And if I would put that in economistic terms, we may be late investors in the market of the language of war and the narratives of war, right? So I think that probably we need to try and maintain the value for previous investments in civilian, power Europe, traditional narratives, albeit being more aware of this language of war that we have outside.
Thank you, Luis, for the consistent introduction. You opened several lines of the discussion. I'm not sure which Magda will choose or how she chooses to continue your thoughts, so I will let her.
Thank you, Luis, for this very professional discourse about the multiple narratives that constitute Europe, the European spirit. I, as a writer and an art historian, will talk a little bit about my own experience as a Romanian living in Paris for quite a long time. And as Radu mentioned, I was a visiting professor there, and then I was the director of the Cultural Institute, Romanian Cultural Institute there. And my experience was very specific in a certain way. I thought I was an European when I arrived there. I was convinced that I was imbued with the European values, that I was educated with the European literature. I spoke English and French, so I had many tools to be considered a European. At that time, Romania was not yet a member of the EU. And nevertheless, I realized little by little that I was not. Or I was not perceived as a real European because I was coming from Eastern Europe, which is something different from Europe and from the Western Europe. And this was a terrible discovery, which was painful and interesting at the same time. I remember when I read Milan Kundera's famous essay, An Occident Kidnappé, Kidnapped West, that he published in the 80s, and which provoked a huge amount of discussions, even in the socialist European countries. because there he sustained that countries from Central and Eastern Europe considered themselves European, while the Occident, the West, had forgotten them because they didn't consider them as really European. And there was this contradiction, this tension between the old image of Central Eastern Europeans, with their literature, as Radu mentioned, and the external perception. And that in this respect, the Central Eastern Europeans felt themselves forgotten by the West. So the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire could kidnap them, and this was the tragedy of Eastern Europe. And this formula, tragedy of Eastern Europe, made a fortune in our cultures from this part of Europe. And this continued even after 1989 and 1990, when the communist regimes fell down in all these countries. And this problem with Eastern Europe is, in my view, has been a long problem, and a topic that produced a lot of questioning and problematization. And Eastern Europe is a territory which is difficult to define, because it is between the West and between the East, which is Russia, which is the Slavic world, so to say. And this region was called in different ways: Middle Europe, the Third Europe, Central Eastern Europe, Oriental Europe, and so on and so forth. Very many denominations in regard with the political or geopolitical situation of the region. So this region had so many problems to define itself, in fact, and we have so many definitions of Eastern Europe from a historical or geopolitical respect, from a religious point of view, from a cultural perspective, and so on and so forth. And even if after 1890 the situation has begun to change in all these countries, even if starting with 2004 a number of countries of this region became members of EU, and then in 2007 Romania and Bulgaria became also members, and so on. I think this difference is still being perceived, can still be perceived between the two parts of Europe, so to say, the western part and the eastern part. And this difference comes from, obviously, from the history of this region, and from the way this region has modernized itself. Because Eastern Europe fell, so to say, under the influence of the Western modernizing rule or time, starting with the 19th century. But it was like an artificial imposing of modernizing over a population that were not at all prepared for this huge change. Only the elite class of these countries wanted so much to become European, to become modern, to become Western, and forced these societies to enter modernism and modernity. And this created many tensions between the levels, the layers of the society. For example, in Romania you have, even now, you have an archaic rural level which contains a majority part of the population. Even now, 40% of the Romanian population belongs to this level. Then you have the Byzantine, post-Byzantine religious level which lasted during the feudal period. And then you have the modern level which started with the 19th century, and now we have also the postmodern level which started from the 90s. And all these levels are still vivid. They are still vivid, they are still productive. They have their own values, principles, products, and so on. And moreover, now Romania has to harmonize all these levels, but also the level of the communist period, which was also a civilization in itself. And we cannot throw it down to the, I don't know, from the constitution of the Romanian society and culture. So these are specificities which cannot be forgotten, and which give a certain taste and a certain way of being for the populations of these regions. Of course, there are differences between Romania and Czech Republic or Poland, Hungary, and so on and so forth, but there are also common denominators which make that we can understand a little bit better our colleagues from Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and so on, because we have something in common. And I think that these specificities were not taken into account always by the European community and by the European structures and institutions and so on. And probably it would have been difficult to take into account all these differences and specificities. But this brought a sort of complex of inferiority to these peoples, which are not so prepared, so well educated to accepting immediately democracy, pluralism, privatization, and all the phenomena that started in the 90s. Nevertheless, these countries become more and more integrated into the European melting pot. We have to acknowledge this. And the interest of the West for this region has evolved during the last 30 years, 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s. I mean, I can tell you that as an art historian, I saw lots of exhibitions, huge cultural events, festivals that tried to synthesize the spirit of this region during this period. And at the beginning it was more like Central Europe because of the Visegrad group, and then it was Central and Eastern Europe which was in the focus of these cultural international events, and then it was Eastern Europe, and then it was Southeastern Europe, and then it was Balkans, and then it was the Western Balkans, and now it's not. In the last years, this interest for this region, in my view, vanished. I mean, it was more and more discreet because these countries are more and more integrated into the European Union, so they are not so interesting anymore. But nowadays we have the Ukrainian war, and suddenly Eastern Europe has become a new topic. A geopolitical topic, which is interesting and new because it's so hard to deal with, and this can offer a chance. This is my last idea. This can offer a chance to this region to become more vivid, more visible, more active, involved in the European politics. And look at how Poland is nowadays. It's so strong, so decisive in its attitudes and decisions. Ukraine is such a huge surprise, and it is also Eastern Europe. We have to acknowledge it. Ukraine is a part of Eastern Europe, of this middle region, which constitutes our region, And even Romania has a chance now to become more involved in the high political struggle. And I would like very much that Romania assume a more active role in this process. And thank you.
I can promise you this is not your last idea. I'm going to try to build a common question for both of you from what I've understood from your interventions. And I was thinking maybe then, after you answer, to open the floor towards the audience. I'm sure there must be questions, reactions, and so on. So, Magda, you talked about something which could be maybe summarized as the unification of Europe. It's like there are two Europes, the Western and the Eastern one, and they need to unify their memories, the memories of their historical traumas and of their specificities and so on. And Louis spoke about how we should define our attitude towards the radical other. So in order to keep maybe civil contracts with, maybe even with an aggressor, but without becoming paranoid and without considering everybody outside Europe a threat, if I can summarize it correctly. So I think these two answers, when you spoke, I think these answers can be unified. And led me to another question. When you were both talking, there came into my mind this book, famous book I think, of contemporary French philosopher René Brague, Europe, la voie romaine. It's a book from the late 90s, Europe, the Roman path, where he asked himself what Europe is, if there is something, some trait, some fundamental trait which we could call Europe. And he came to this answer that the fundamental European characteristic is secondarity, which sounds complicated maybe, but it's something very simple. It's, Brague says, it's looking outside oneself, seeing something fundamentally alien, strange, something which is not even alterity, so to say. Internalize it, metabolize it, and transform it into identity. This is what secondarity is, in practice. And he gives historical examples, famous historical examples. The Romans taking the Greek authority and transforming it into identity. They start measuring their values according to the Greek ones, and so on. Okay? Europe taking Christianity, which is born at the limits of the geographical Europe, in non-European languages, and transforming Christianity into its backbone for 16th, 17th centuries, okay? And so on. This is what secondarity is. So this is important because it seems to me that it's if secondarity is a European trait, if René Brague is right, then we have to not lose it, so to say. To be able to look at the other, even if it's a radical alien to us, a radical authority, but to be able to internalize and metabolize it, and transform it into parts of our identity. This is, I think, what we may risk losing if we close within Europe as within a citadel, which is under threat now, it's true, but if we preserve this mechanism, this psychological mechanism of the besieged citadel forever, maybe Europe stops being Europe. Mm-hmm. And it's also within you. This is in the attitude outside Europe, what Louis was saying. Mm-hmm. What Magda was speaking about was the attitude within Europe, inside Europe. It's like treating the Eastern European as something other than European, and vice versa. And even the concept of Eastern European is unfair, because if we take, for example, only the Danube, which unifies the eastern part of the continent, it travels through, 12 countries, maybe more. Even in the Roman Empire, it unified, I think, 9 kingdoms, from Bavaria, Stygia to Pannonia, Mercia, and Pontus, Euxines, and so on. So, and now it's territories which are Catholic, which are Protestant, which are Orthodox, which are Islamic, some of them. And it's very different territories, and we label them Eastern Europe as the Eastern European identity, even though it's something very variegated and diverse. And so this danger is also inside Europe, of not being able to see the authorities of the other, the specificities of the other. And maybe if we lose this mechanism, this ability to take authority and transform it into identity, maybe we risk stopping being European, if I understood correctly what you said. So I'm not sure I have a question.
I think that's a fantastic reflection, Radu, I very much agree with you. I remember I read Blaga's book in my master's in European Studies in Poland, and I think you are making a very interesting reading there, because actually alterity, incorporating alterity and this sort of cosmopolitan view, I think is very, I would say it's essential for what I meant of this narrative of openness as well. In the sense, there's a very beautiful book by Salvador de Madariaga, he was president of the cultural committee of the Council of Europe in the conference in 1948, and he has a book called, well, I wouldn't translate that in English, or I don't know the word, but basically he starts saying Europe will exist culturally when Spaniards are able to say or Krakow, and when Romanians are able to say or Bruges, that you actually identify other parts of Europe as part of your own culture. And I think that's true. I think that needs to shape our attitude as Europeans as well. And I don't know if we need to say or Beijing or Johannesburg, but really I think as Europeans we need to look beyond our own territories, our own identity, to really shape this new relation to the world. And this is interesting for Elena, because our students, we have had a deliberative forum with students from 3 universities during the entire year, and one of the things that always comes back with students when they want to show pro-Europeanness is we need to create a course on European Union at school. And I always get very tired of this day. I think it's very lazy. I always, when I discuss with students, I told them, I think what we need is a European education, not exactly a course on Europe. Basically, I think we need a cosmopolitan education. So I think that this is what we need in terms of building this Europe, right? Is this looking at the other as if it was part of yourself.
There is this Spanish politician, you must know him, Javier Nart, who functioned as the vice president of the European Parliament. And when we had these protests in Romania in 2018, we were invited to Brussels, to the European Parliament, to present our discontents with the Romanian government. And we had a talk there outside the European Parliament with Javier Nart, and with this lady. She runs the Green Party in Germany. I can't remember her name right now, but it started raining, like, and it was a very cold rain, March in Brussels, you can imagine. And we had no umbrellas and so on, and everybody stayed. And it was so cold and freezing. We were talking live, it was live on Facebook and so on. And I asked Javier Nart, you can check, the question is there in the Facebook panel. I asked him, so, Mr. Nart, why do you, a Spanish politician, stay in a freezing rain to discuss about the rule of law in Romania where you have no constituents? And he said, and this is almost exactly your words, Luis. He said, because Andalusia is Romania and Moldavia is Spain. This is what Europe means. It's his exact words, and I think it's, so he was a European, able to stay, to withhold the freezing rain for the rule of law in some part of Europe. So, Magda.
Yeah, this is a beautiful idea, and I totally agree with it. What you said about Libra, I want to tell you that this is a common idea in the French milieu, that the European spirit means to accept criticism and self-criticism, and to transform it into a form of evolution, of bettering the things. And I remember that even Susan Sontag in the 90s came to Paris to give a lecture at the university where I was, and she said the same thing, and she was so proud to say it because, and she was an American, of course, because this seemed to her the strength, the force, the fundamental force of the European spirit, to accept, to accumulate from other cultures, and to transform them into its own value, and to accept self-criticism, which is the most important thing. And she underlined that Europe is the only culture that assumed this criticism and self-criticism in such a vivid way. And this is true and obvious, but of course there must be some limits in everything, and in accepting too many influences. you have to digest them and to transform them into your own identity, little by little, or so on. So politics is a very subtle game to play and to sustain, to keep a balance between outputs and inputs in such a way that you do not destroy the European spirit. And what is European spirit is a huge question, but everybody of us know a little bit what the European spirit is. We recently talked about this, Radu and me here. And it is also related to the idea of a soul for Europe, as you mentioned. And I remember Jacques Delors, who was a French politician and who was president of the European Commission in the 80s. He said that Europe needs a soul. Europe needs a soul. And he had in mind the same idea that it is not enough to have good institutions, to have extremely developed legislation, to have financial programs and so on and so forth, which are very useful, of course, but it's not enough to create a unity, a European unity, as you mentioned. And we need something more. And this something more, it's very difficult to define, but it means, first of all, culture. It means to have cultural exchanges, to have translation, because translation is the real language of Europe, as Umberto Eco said, and to have this kind of mixages, cultural mixages between regions and populations. And I love very much this idea to be I don't know, Toscana and Moldavia, and Toscana, and this kind of, and what is positive is that, for example, in Romania, recently a Euronews TV channel in Romanian started only a few weeks ago, and it's in Romanian. So this is very important, because I used to look at the Euronews in English because it was the only one. And now we have this in Romanian. Probably it will exist also in other languages, and this will create the necessary mass media instrument to unify and to homogenize more our people.
Can I just add one more thing that, because I think the Roman past is also an example of narratives in conflict, right? Because we have this Rome that stopped conquering the world and looked inside, and which have philosopher and emperors like Marcus Aurelius and so on, who was able to incorporate the new migrants and have actually the new migrants be the new generals, and actually the Roman army was full of gods and hands and whatever it is. But you also had the ones that wanted to go back to the past, right, and make Rome great again. Now, why say that? Because, well, Western Europeans are not the only ones thinking that we descended already from the Romans. You will know that since the 16th century, every Muscovian ruler has seen himself as a third Rome, and as in the famous movie Ivan the Terrible, there will be no fourth. Right? So this is a bit of the concern, right? Now, is Mr. Putin seeing himself as Justinian, trying to regain the lost territories at the time of crisis? Now, that's a bit of too much speculation, but this reclaiming this Roman identity and different versions of the Roman identity, I think it's also a very good example of how narratives shape these international politics.
True. So now, probably there are questions or interventions from the audience.
I completely agree that translating media...
Sorry, can you present yourself?
A student at PVSC, GSC, is a journalism and media-based university. And I completely agree that translating the language to every country, or to as many countries as possible, is helping. It's certainly helping, because we cannot assume that everybody knows a universal language. So with this, we can reach more people, and we can give more awareness about being European and what is happening that's truly important to us Europeans. I think this helps.
Yeah, I think translation is besides what Eko famously said, translation is also the language of liberty, of freedom. And I found a sort of ironic, sarcastic compliment, or even unintentional compliment to the idea of translation and translator, when I read in Burhan Sönmez, the Turkish prose writer who runs PEN International. He says that in contemporary Turkish prisons, the tortionaries call the clubs they are beating the prisoners with translators. Which is, of course, an unintentional compliment. They know what the real enemy is. It's the translator, the free mind who travels between cultures and cannot be stopped. Sorry.
That's a very interesting view. I don't know, maybe some control for some countries on how you translate things and how you send the information.
Is this a question for Magda and Luis?
No, it's a comment.
Ah, okay, sorry.
No, that's a comment, I apologize. Yeah, maybe a little bit of control when it comes to sending information to certain countries in order to not find any misunderstandings would be ideal.
If I may, because the conference is entitled Founding Translation. So this is one of the things we wrote into the project, and what we meant is that, of course, linguistic translation is essential. I think what you described rather very beautifully, this language of liberty. But what we argue as well is that we need a sort of political translation, that basically, if Europe is to work, we cannot expect to have a single European public consuming all the time the same news, having a single interpretation of facts, and not even in such an extraordinary context as war in Ukraine, we are going to have that. I mean, of course, war in Ukraine cannot mean the same thing for someone living on the Polish border as someone living in Algeciras in the Gibraltar Strait in Spain. I mean, it's impossible. What we need is to have mediators, cultural, political, all kinds of mediators that are able to decode the messages coming from European institutions, coming from all the European countries, and tell us why this is relevant for you. Why? I mean, there's one very obvious reason that applies in terms of the alternative. You're saying why we are concerned about the war in Ukraine, because it could be us. I mean, of course, we are very easily transported into the shoes of someone living in Kharkiv. But at the same time, we need to also be convinced of why this is concerning for us, not only on the emotional level, but also on the political, economic, social, and cultural ways. So I said, in the sense, what I think what Europe needs is really to have this network of cultural and political translators and mediators able to sort of decode the messages coming from Brussels.
I would add also that, in my view, there's not enough European information on the mass media in the European countries. This is the experience of Romania, at least. But when I was in France, it was the same. I mean, only in moments of crisis like this one, suddenly Europe becomes a huge topic, and we hear it every evening, so to say. But in the meanwhile, it is very few. And this is a feeble point which has to be corrected, because Europe should be more than EU, more than the European Union. It should be a cultural topic, a geostrategic topic of local mass media, literary and so on, because otherwise you cannot have this European spirit. This is really very important, and we should militate for it, because it's essential.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, Magda. Ukraine is on the news in the last 3-4 months. It was never in the news when Timothy Snyder wrote his 2 books, Bloodlands and Black Earth, showing that World War II was all about Ukraine. Nobody cared. So what? Yeah, that's history. It will never happen again. Look, it does. It does. So maybe this is also one of the questions. How do we transform history into historic consciousness? That it can happen, it can repeat, and it concerns us. But maybe we should take some other questions from the audience. Oh, no. Yes, please, Helena.
I would like to make just 2 comments. we are cooperating with a colleague that has started a project to help to translate more academic reflection and to in a way translate it for a more general public. And he was telling us, this is very interesting and we know this very well. He told us that when in the blogs and the policy briefs and the news, he uses in the title the European Union, nobody reads it. But that he has realized that more and more they are reading articles related to what is happening in different places of Europe and different countries and different problems. But that to use this European Union as such, as a label, is something that people are like more like, well, what is this? And we don't have any kind of emotional or interest or so. But that there is this concern on Europe. And just a comment, because you were explaining your experience in France, and I remember when Spain and the Spaniards, when they were telling us that Europe started in the Pyrenees, so they ignored us absolutely. The Portuguese and the Spaniards, they didn't belong to the idea of Europe. No. So this is something that takes some time. And related to that, you say, well, maybe in this context now, Romania can have more, I would say power, but more
Agency.
influence or can be an agency. But I think it also depends on the country. So it's just sometimes that, we are not so interested or we are not really trying to have this role on the European Union. So this is important that you have the momentum, but also it's a question also of willingness of the different countries to have this role on Europe.
I think what was impressive in Ukraine's case, was the reaction of countries, not necessarily the ones neighboring Ukraine. I think Poland, Romania, Hungary reacted beautifully. The citizens did what they had to do. The politicians, maybe not so much, not always, but in the end they complied. But when the war started, I was in Washington, D.C. And some guys who were walking on the street celebrating their 25th anniversary asked me to take a photo of them. And I did. And they asked me, where are you from? I said, Romania. And they immediately started talking about Ukraine. And the lady, she was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s. She said, she was an American from Baltimore. She said, spontaneously, it's not only about Ukraine, it's about all of us. And it's almost the other side of the planet. And everybody feels that it's about all of us. And this is, I think, this gives me hope that we can redefine not only Europe, US, we can redefine liberty, freedom, the language of liberal democracies, of people who want to be able to preserve diversity, freedom of speech, translation, moving across cultures and so on. A few days ago, Olga Tokarczuk said, it was a discussion, and she said also about a topic similar to this one. And she said, a narrative which allows only one interpretation or no interpretation is propaganda. So this is what we should avoid in Europe, maybe. This unidimensional interpretation of narratives. But I'm talking too much, sorry. Some other questions, reactions, interventions? Yes, please.
I will start by saying hello. It's a pleasure to me to meet such a distinguished guest. I'm an adept of federalism, and we talked earlier about Europe soul. I want to ask you if you think that federalism and moving in that direction with Europe will solve such problems as Europe identity, Europe values, Europe unity, as we all the nations that are in Europe are now very different in such traditions and everything. And in my opinion, I can't say that it's an actually unity in Europe. It's just by by law. And what do you think? Could it solve this unity? Could it give to Europe the power of a real I don't know how to say that, but I think you got my point. Could it take that power as America has now, and that spirit of loving Europe? We don't have it now.
Hopefully we will have 76 constitution. And hopefully we will have the Supreme Court essentially, I would say. I think, especially as a federalist, I can always be cautious when speaking about that, but I would say it depends on how we understand federalism, because when we speak about European Federation, we tend to think about giving more functions, more power to Brussels. But from a federal point of view, maybe the EU is already doing too much. So I think that we need to put European federalists in front of a mirror and say, maybe federalism means, well, certainly a European army. I think that would be part of any federal construction. But maybe we don't need, and I'm going to be a bit provocative, maybe we don't need Erasmus in a federation, because that's something you need to do close to the citizen now. Of course, it's a provocation. Erasmus is not about organizing education, but maybe we are doing a bit too many things for a federation. Now, another thing that I think is always to keep in mind about federalism is maybe we would be losing one thing about this duality, in the sense that federalism is about federal loyalty. And I think federalism established a very bidirectional relation between the federation and the member states. But in this context, member states tend to forget a bit about the others. They tend to think that they only need to have a direct relation with Washington, with Brussels and so on. And probably what the EU needs is to foster much more solidarity between member states. Now, probably we need a bit of both. I mean, I would say, we clearly need to make the rules of the game clear. Europeans need to understand who does what, who is responsible for what. So for this, federalism would be good. But we also need to maintain this idea that there's one thing that journalists keep saying that pro-Europeans hate, and which I think remains a very good description of Europe, which is the EU is a club. Now, of course, all specialists of EU studies say, if you write up the exam, I will fail you. But I like the idea that in the end, a club is something that works on mutual understanding, mutual respect and so on. So it can be very elitist, I know. So this is what we need a bit less of. But probably what's good for Europe is a mixture of federalism, clarification of competencies and so on, with this notion of strength and solidarity between the member states, which I think in some federal systems, not in all, I mean, for instance, Germany would be maybe a better example for us, I would say, probably than the US. Certainly not US federalism for the Europeans.
Well, I'm not a specialist, but I noticed that Europe functions at different speeds. States members have different ages concerning their statehood and their history. So they have different reactions in front of the idea of federalism, even if this idea was first formulated by a Romanian, Constantin Popovici. Yes, at the beginning of the 20th century, he wrote a book, The United States of Europe, or the Federal States.
Of Austria. United States of Greater Austria.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes, yeah. Right. So this was the idea of a federalist
and he was a close friend of Franz Ferdinand, the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary.
Yeah. But on the other side, I noticed in Romania that there is a reaction also against too much unification with the European Union, and we have movements of nationalism and everywhere a little bit, especially in this Eastern European region, and also of re-ethnicization. There are trends of this kind which I wrote in the Balkans mostly. So it's a complicated situation. I don't know if we are already mature enough for this
There's an interesting book published by Marlene Wied, who is a Danish professor from the University of Copenhagen. She became very well known in the state because she was discussing with Mr. Puigdemont when he went lecturing in Copenhagen. The book, trustingly for what Magda was saying before, is called The Balkanization of Europe. Sorry, the tribalization of Europe. I think in Spain it's suggested translating it as Balkanization, right? In the sense that Europe is becoming at the same time more integrated, but Europeans are developing more tribal identities. So this is why Sibiu was saying there's a sort of Balkanization, which I think is always, at least in Western European terms, when something is Balkanic, it's bad. Right? So I think probably we need also to have a specific narrative of how we refer to parts of Europe.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Maybe without the mask. Thank you very much for this very, very interesting discussion. I remember what I really liked when I was here in Romania was the idea of Europe and how Romanian writers were portraying the idea of Europe in Romanian literature. So this was very, very interesting. And later I studied political science, and this is very central also in what we are doing. So this is a very interesting discussion, and thank you very much. Now, what we discussed is that we have different narratives in Central and Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, Southern Europe, Balkans, and so on and so forth. But as a political scientist, what I see is that we have also different narratives clashing within the same territory. We have a very antagonistic Poland, which is split in two. We have Belgium, which is also split in, and there is a very strong conflict in there. And maybe we Romanians, some of us, we have very much in common with rural France, I don't know, or we have very much in common with the Flemish in the north. So this is a bit the idea, and it's not really a question that I have, it's maybe a call for all of us here, writers and scientists, political scientists and Europeans, maybe also to see what we have in common across national lines and beyond borders, because this is not only a topic for political sociology. This can be a very interesting topic to see how we, at 2,000 kilometers, we have in common. And I think this is also a way not to create a new identity, but to understand each other, that we, some of us Romanians, are not so typical from Flanders and Flemish community. I say, and I give this example because I live in Flanders, so I see some connections from time to time. But what I wanted to emphasize is this idea that, and I give again the case of Poland, that because it is very, very relevant to see a country divided, and probably the case of Spain and also Italy and France. We see it with the last elections in France, where also there we have conflicting narratives which are on ideological lines also. So this was one of the points, and then because you know more than me, again, back to what you said about Romanian literature, and maybe Luis could help us with Spain, is that I remember the old debate in Romania and the attitude of Romanians in the 19th century vis-à-vis Europe. You know, this idea of modernization and so on. This is a question for you, and I know probably it's a too broad question, but what has changed since then? Do we still perpetuate the same, narratives that we had at the core of the Romanian state formation? What has changed? Because now we have 3 decades since we are members of the European Union. We have the experience of being part of Europe. So this is maybe a general question that we can have also over me. But I'm very interested in this topic. Is that, are we still cultivating the same ideas and the same myths or the same narratives, or do we see a bit something different? With regards to, it's not only continuity, but it's also, how do you say it, rupture and continuity. It's exactly, thank you very much for, you see, because this is also, maybe, and I will finish with that, is that we talk all the time about translation, but my regret, and I will conclude with that, is that my regret with Erasmus and the program and the mobility is that we all speak exactly, and this is really, my heart is broken, because the idea of Erasmus was precisely that, to understand each other in our own languages, and here we are speaking open English. My heart is French, and of course. So this was my comments. So maybe to talk a bit, not only to talk a bit narratives and narratives in conflict within member states, within nation states. Thank you very much. It was more a comment. It was not.
I think there was one more comment, but maybe.
And maybe then final answer from
Yeah.
Okay, please.
Yes, it's a comment, not a question. I consider that the European project will successful one. The messages of the European Union must be adapted to different public. Not to speak. You cannot build Europe with elites. You must adapt. Because only few people are rejecting freedom. Only few people can reject the modernization. The majority, if they are rejecting something, they are rejecting the means. How they are imposed. How they are, because we cannot build in Romania the Western civilization over the night. Only Stalin, only in a totalitarian state, you can transform the society over the night. But with what human price? And also, I consider that also the Eastern Europe can offer its experience to the Western one. Not only the Western Europe to the Eastern one. When we have an experience with the Russians, not only us, the Russians, also the Poles, the Baltics, the Finland. And in the West, no one wanted to listen to the Eastern people when they said, don't make business with the Russians. Don't listen to the Russians. Because you know better the Russians. You know nothing, said the West. When half of the European Union, the Eastern half of the European Union told to Angela Merkel, don't build Nord Stream 2, because after the will be finished, the Russians will close the gas to us. Angela Merkel rejected the idea of a common energetic policy of the European Union.
I think you're right. I think part of the problem started being solved. I remember in September 2019, there was adopted this resolution of the European Parliament condemning communism as a criminal ideology on the same terms as fascism, Nazism, and so on. So this was the western part of Europe started to officially accept the Eastern trauma. So putting them on the same level and starting treating them like criminal ideologies altogether. So it needs to go further and further on, as you say. So maybe some final answers? Or
yeah, I mean, it's not easy to reply to both, but maybe a shared idea is, to start with the last observation, that the Eastern Europe has a message for Western Europe, and think in relation to this totalitarian transformation of society, I think the European Union is an example of non-totalitarian but very radical transformation of European societies, and I think that what Romania and other Eastern European countries are experiencing is very similar to what Spain and Portugal experienced in the 80s. A very rapid transformation, a sort of culmination probably of the transformation of these layers of society that Magda mentioned, right? Because you were speaking about the rural traditions and so on. This is one of the things that the European Union is changing, and it's not doing it with regulations, it's doing it with probably better roads and transport infrastructure. Now,
yeah.
I imagine that Bucharest will become much bigger in the coming years. It will keep attracting people from all the country. This is what we are seeing in Madrid. It has become a totally megalopolis just because it has emptied the territory, and I'm not saying that the EU is to blame, but the infrastructures financed with EU money is to some extent to blame or to thank, depending on understanding the issue, right? So my point there is we need to understand this, because this is what we see superficially when we land in Bucharest or in Madrid or wherever, but under this you still have traditional narratives that we need to understand how society works. And this is where I don't know how it has changed in Romania, but I would say in Spain...
Just a little bit. I didn't express myself. I wanted to say that starting from the Romanian experience, or how communicate the politicians about COVID-19. They didn't care about the commons, the people that aren't so high educated like some of them, that graduated at Harvard or some, because they spoke only for the elites. Let me see. Because part of the population of the society of Romania is against the means of the transformation. It's not against of the European Union.
But this is probably connected. I don't know. I don't want to speculate about Romanian in a sense, but if I am speculating, I would say maybe this connects with Romanian experiences of communism, precisely that.
Yes,
When you have central government and you stay at home, it probably
totalitarian.
reminds you of something. So this is why I say we need to remember of the past narratives, and this is how I connect to narratives of Europe in Spain. Of course, we are seeing the transformation. We now have a party like Vox, so we start to have a clear Eurosceptic narrative in Spain, but at the same time, the political consensus in Spain remains very much what I mentioned before, 1898. There's this famous sentence by Ortega, Spain is a problem, Europe is the solution. This is still shaping our pro-European attitude. I mean, it has changed slightly, but we tend to see there's a very nice expression by Spanish politicians, which is los países de nuestro entorno, which means literally the countries around us. Now, by that, they don't mean Morocco or Algeria, they mean France, Italy, the UK, and so on. So, I mean, when you say this, it's setting the expectation of how Spain should behave, and this expectation always remains European. Like, and sometimes we, this is also very Catholic, we want to be more Pope than the Pope, and if France is doing something, I don't know, which extends rights, we'll do twice as much as France, because that means that we are on the right track to modernity. So this is something that where probably the experience of Spain during all these crises should have been shaken. You could have said during the Euro crisis, Spaniards would have started thinking this is no longer true, but probably the narrative has been adapted in the sense that if Europe is punishing us for this and that, we probably deserve it. So, I mean, it is a narrative that really has prevented all the recent crises transforming into a more massive Eurosceptic movement in Spain. So I'm not saying it's not changing, but what I find surprising is the sort of resilience of these traditional narratives. I don't know if in Romania we could say anything.
I totally agree with you, and I thought it was a specificity of Romania, because Romania has entered the European Union only 15 years ago, which is a short period of time. But at the same time, I have to say that I noticed changes which have started to transform our country, our society. In the 2000s, I wrote some texts about, influenced by Gianni Vattimo, for example, in which I affirmed, I said that Romania is for the European Union like a cultural park of archaeological remains, so to say. You see what I mean? So traditional rural vestiges, popular costumes and so on, and that maybe this would be a solution for Romania to become a sort of Disneyland or culture park for the tradition and the memory of Europe. Because many of these traditions had existed also in the Western countries, but have disappeared 2 or 3 centuries ago. And Romania is a little bit late, so it can offer these examples and keep them alive. This is the sense, to keep them alive. It's like a zoo, a cultural zoo, in a sense. But I have the impression that this starts to change even in Romania. I mean, the European influence is strong enough, and Romanians have a huge percentage of being for EU. You know, we are on the first place in the European scale of acceptance. And I have the impression that we will lose this specificity. I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's a reality. And the fact that you mentioned the same thing in Spain makes me accept it as inevitable. I don't know.
Yeah, on this optimistic tone, I think we could thank Luis and Magda for their wonderful thank Miruna and Elena for putting together this beautiful event.
Thank you, Radu.
Yes, and Radu for moderating. I'm jumping in
because I had the feeling that I was totally interrupted by the rain. Thank you, all of you. I also wanted to make a special thanks to the ambassador of Italy that is among us today. Elena, that came from Spain, together with Taru Hapala from Finland. We have journalist Judy Florescu, we have students, some of them spoke. We have our colleagues, Ramona Coman, also a partner in our project, and Alexandra Ivan, that will be a speaker tomorrow from the University of Bucharest. I wanted to underline this just to show that this was our dream in 2019 when we wrote this project for the European Commission. We wanted to have a discussion, an authentic discussion about what Europe means for very different people, and not to be in a university, not to be blinded by ideological filters, and to have an honest discussion. And I, as an observer, had this feeling that we had this. So I wanted to thank all of you, and because we know that food for thought is not enough, we would invite you also for some real food and a glass of wine for the next hour to spend together and maybe change some ideas, because the rain stopped. So we can enjoy the garden. Thank you very much.